welcome. You're watching World Today, a window to the world. Our top focus today is the options before the United States as it decides to review its ties with Pakistan because of its dodgy role in Afghanistan. Also on the show, Prime Minister Narendra Modi spoke with his Australian counterpart Scott Morrison today ahead of the Quad Summit in Washington, D.C. next week. That and more news from around the world. I'm Munun Bhattacharya. First up, the headlines. Exercising its right to reply in response to malicious, false and baseless statements made by Pakistan and the OIC at the 48th session of the United Nations Human Rights Council, India calls out Pakistan at the UNHRC for being the worst abuser of human rights. With the humanitarian crisis reaching worrying levels in Afghanistan, the international community pledges aid of over $1 billion to help Afghans at a donor conference under the auspices of UN in Geneva. U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken says in a U.S. Congress hearing that Biden administration will review its ties with Pakistan in light of Islamabad's duplicitous role in Afghanistan. Blinken tells the House of Representatives Foreign Affairs Committee that Pakistan has a multiplicity of interests, some that are in conflict with ours. US President Joe Biden says extreme weather events are set to cost the United States well over $100 billion this year, topping last year's cost of $99 billion. Says nearly 1 in 3 American communities have been struck in the past few months by weather disasters exacerbated by climate change. World battles COVID-19. So far, over 22 crore 66 lakh and 87,000 cases have been reported globally, while the number of recoveries stand above 20 crore 34 lakh and 10,000. The 76th session of the United Nations General Assembly opens at UN headquarters in New York. Maldivian diplomat Abdullah Shahid, who was elected as president of the 76th UNGA in June, takes oath of office during the ceremony and received the gavel from Volkan Bozkir, president of the 75th UNGA. Yet another billionaire entrepreneur set to ride into space as Inspiration 4 mission, all set to blast off from the Kennedy Space Center at Cape Canaveral, Florida on Thursday morning IST. SpaceX rocket ship set to make history as the first all-civilian crew will launch into Earth orbit. Let's begin with the big news. Exercising its right to reply in response to the malicious, false and baseless statements made by Pakistan at the 48th session of the United Nations Human Rights Council, India retaliated, exposing Pakistan's hollow commitment to human rights, calling out a failed state like Pakistan for being the worst abuser of human rights. India said that the country has been globally recognized for openly supporting and training terrorists and has failed to protect rights of its minorities.
It has become a habit for Pakistan to misuse the platforms provided by the Council to propagate false and malicious propaganda against my country. The Council is aware of Pakistan's attempts to divert the Council's attention from serious human rights violations being perpetrated by its government, including in the territories occupied by it. Pakistan has failed to protect the rights of its minorities, including Sikhs, Hindus, Christians and Ahmadiyas. Thousands of women and girls from minority communities have been subjected to abductions, forced marriages and conversions in Pakistan and its occupied territories. Pakistan has been engaged in systematic persecution, forced conversions, targeted killings, sectarian violence and faith-based discrimination against its ethnic and religious minorities. Incidents of violence against minority communities, including attacks on their places of worship, their cultural heritage as well as their private property, have taken place with impunity. A climate of fear continues to drastically impact the daily lives of minorities. Madam Vice President, dissenting voices from civil societies, human rights defenders, journalists are muzzled daily in Pakistan with the support of the government. Enforced disappearances, extrajudicial killings, murders and abductions have been used as a tool for subjugation and to muzzle any form of dissent or criticism. The impunity with which such abuses have been carried out exposes the hollowness of Pakistan's commitment to human rights. Pakistan is a country which has been globally recognized as a country openly supporting, training, financing and arming terrorists, including the UN proscribed terrorists, as a matter of state policy. The relevant multilateral institutions have been raising serious concerns on its failure to stop terror financing and lack of effective actions against terrorist entities. Madam Vice President, we once again regret and reject the reference made by the OIC to the Union Territory of Jammu and Kashmir, which is an integral part of India. The OIC has no locus standi to comment on internal matters of India. The OIC has helplessly allowed itself to be held hostage by Pakistan, which holds the chairmanship of the Geneva chapter, to subserve its own agenda. It's for the members of the OIC to decide if it is in their interest to allow Pakistan to do so. Madam Vice President, India is not only the world's largest democracy, but a robustly functional and vibrant one, does not need lessons from a failed state like Pakistan, which is the epicenter of terrorism and worst abuser of human rights.
With the humanitarian crisis reaching worrying levels in Afghanistan, the international community has pledged aid of over $1 billion to help Afghans at a donor conference under the auspices of the UN in Geneva, and now there are indications that more aid could flow in.
Within a month since taking control over Afghanistan and days after forming the interim government in the country, Taliban called for international donors to restart aid. Notably, a majority of international donors, including the United States, the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank, have cut off Afghanistan's access to funds after Taliban returned to power. This has resulted in a widespread liquidity crunch in the cash-dependent economy. Afghanistan is heavily reliant on external assistance after 4 decades of near continuous war. Afghanistan's acting foreign minister Amir Khan Muttaqi said that the international community should not politicize their assistance.
Afghanistan has been a war-torn country for the past 3 or 4 decades. It has seen destruction and troubles of all sorts. It has been hit by bombs and missiles. It needs the international community's assistance in different sectors, especially education, health and development. We want good relations with the international community. We want mutual relations. We demand the international community not to put any further pressure on the Afghans.
European Union chief Ursula von der Leyen has vowed to boost humanitarian aid to Afghanistan. In a tweet, she pledged the 27-nation bloc stands by the Afghan people. Speaking at her annual State of the European Union address, she tweeted that EU must do everything to avert the real risk that is out there of a major famine and humanitarian disaster. And EU will do its part. It will increase again humanitarian aid for Afghanistan by 100 million euros. Earlier this week, the United Nations Secretary General Antonio Guterres said that poverty and hunger have spiraled in the country since foreign aid dried up, raising the specter of a mass exodus. The UN appealed for $606 million to meet the most pressing needs of a country in crisis. Meanwhile, the Taliban have denied rumors of death of their former head and Deputy Prime Minister of Afghanistan, Mullah Abdul Ghani Baradar, being killed in a shootout with rivals. A Taliban spokesman, Suhail Shaheen, said that Baradar has issued a voice message rejecting claims that he had been killed or injured in a clash. The denials followed days of rumors that supporters of Baradar had clashed with those of Sirajuddin Haqqani, who heads the Haqqani network that is based near the border with Pakistan and was blamed for some of the worst suicide attacks of the war. Baradar had not been seen in public for some time and was not part of the ministerial delegation which met Qatari Foreign Minister Sheikh Mohammed bin Abdul Rahman Al Thani in Kabul on September 12th. Bureau Report, DD India.
Well, the U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken told a U.S. congressional hearing that the U.S. administration will review its ties with Pakistan in light of Islamabad's support for Taliban terrorists while professing to help Washington in Afghanistan. In the first public hearing in U.S. Congress about Afghanistan since last month's collapse of the U.S.-backed Afghan government, Blinken told the House of Representatives Foreign Affairs Committee that Pakistan has a duplicity of interests that are in conflict with us. Here's more.
US Secretary of State Antony Blinken has said that US will be looking at its relationship with Pakistan in the coming weeks to formulate what role Washington would want it to play in the future of Afghanistan. In the first public hearing in Congress about Afghanistan since last month's collapse of the US-backed Afghan government, Blinken told the House of Representatives Foreign Affairs Committee that Pakistan has a multiplicity of interests, some that are in conflict with those of the US. He added that Pakistan is one that's involved in hedging its bets constantly about the future of Afghanistan. Pakistan is the one that's involved harboring members of the Taliban while also being involved in different points of cooperation with US on counter-terrorism. Asked by lawmakers if it is time for Washington to reassess its relationship with Pakistan, Blinken said that the administration would soon be doing that. He said, "This is one of the things that we are going to be looking at in the days and the weeks ahead. The role that Pakistan has played over the last 20 years, but also the role we would want to see it play in the coming years and what it will take for it to do that." Pakistan has had deep ties with the Taliban and has been accused of supporting the group as it battled the US-backed government in Kabul for 20 years. It is also considered as one of the two countries, along with Qatar, with the most influence over the Taliban and a place where many senior Taliban leaders were thought to have escaped to after the US-led invasion of Afghanistan in 2001. Meanwhile, US Secretary of State also told the Congress that the United States is in touch with India regarding the over-the-horizon capabilities and plans. The so-called over-the-horizon capabilities US President Joe Biden has repeatedly touted make identifying and striking terrorists with aerial surveillance and drones launched from outside the country. When asked whether the Biden administration has reached out to India as a possible staging area for future over-the-horizon forces capabilities, Blinken said that the Biden administration is deeply engaged with India. The Biden administration's over-the-horizon strategy in Afghanistan is drawing serious questions from lawmakers and counter-terrorism experts as the US withdrawal shifts calculations about threats and capabilities. United States President Joe Biden and Prime Minister Narendra Modi will meet later this month in a first in-person coordinators meeting in Washington. Bureau Report, DD India.
So Pakistan has played a destabilizing role in Afghanistan for several decades. Let's now understand the history of Pakistan's duplicitous or dodgy role in Afghanistan, when and how it started. Well, Pakistan's strategy has been for decades of setting fires in South Asia and then expecting praise and also money for offering to put them out. So it is the arsonist, but it wants the whole world to believe that it is the firefighter. Pakistan's involvement in Afghanistan goes back many decades. Let's understand history after this slide. 1973, ISI was tasked with deepening links between Pakistani and Afghan Islamist groups. So ISI had its task cut out. It had to deepen the links between Islamist groups in Afghanistan as well as in Pakistan. Pakistan Army and ISI created key Islamist groups that became the cornerstone of anti-Soviet jihad. So these Islamist groups played a key role in pushing out the Soviets from Afghanistan. ISI, very importantly, has nurtured, created and supported the Taliban in their first incarnation after the fall of the Mujahideen government in the 1990s. Then ISI returned to doing the same after the Taliban regime's fall in late 2001. It sheltered the Taliban rulers after the US invasion in Afghanistan after 9/11 in 2001. Let's look further into Pakistan's strategy. This is what the then US Secretary of State Hillary Clinton had famously told a Pakistani delegation in 2011. She had said that you can't keep snakes in your backyard and expect them only to bite your neighbors. So this was the famous quote of Hillary Clinton when she was the US Secretary of State in 2011. Also, the ISI, remember, has used the Haqqani network in Afghanistan to harm Indian interests there. You would remember the 2008 terror attack that had taken place on the Indian embassy in Kabul. The Haqqani network is said to have played a major role in that, and that attack was orchestrated by the ISI. Also, Pakistan has engineered the return of the Taliban in Afghanistan in 2011. So, Pakistan did play a key role. The border areas facilitated the return of the Taliban in Afghanistan. Also, Pakistan has a clear imprint as far as the present government in Afghanistan is concerned. You would remember that Sirajuddin Haqqani is the interior minister of Afghanistan under the new dispensation in Afghanistan, and Sirajuddin Haqqani is a well-known stooge of the Pakistani ISI and army. Let's go across now for perspective to Ambassador Prabhu Dayal. He is a former Indian ambassador. Welcome, Ambassador Dayal, to World Today. Your thoughts on what Antony Blinken has had to say at the US Congress hearing recently. He said that the United States is keen on reviewing or reassessing its ties with Pakistan. The role that Pakistan has played in Afghanistan of running with the hare and hunting with the hound is quite well known. Would you say a belated acknowledgement by the Biden administration?
Well, I would also say better late than never. Because for a very long time, the United States administration has shown that it is aware of the duplicitous role which Pakistan has been playing in Afghanistan. But the tragedy is that the US has not been very keen on taking firm action against Pakistan. You would recall that President Trump had also famously said that while America had given billions of dollars in aid to Pakistan,
yes,
in return the Pakistanis had only given lies and deceit. So it is not that America has not been aware of the sort of role which the Pakistanis have been playing and how they have been so utterly duplicitous. But as I said earlier, it has been tragic that action against Pakistan has not been taken. And as you said, Pakistan has been allowed to run with the hare and hunt with the hound. And it is well known that the Haqqani network is a creation of Pakistan, as also is the Taliban itself. So all these forces which had been very actively working against US interests were allowed to do so with the full backing and connivance of Pakistan. And the US intelligence agencies had been warning their government of the sort of activities of the ISI within Afghanistan. But for whatever reasons, these warnings were not heeded. Now, maybe things have been allowed to drift far too long. The situation in Afghanistan, as we all know, is very close to disaster. The Taliban regime has been ensconced there a second time. Human rights have been thrown out of the window by the new regime. And the people of the country are facing a calamity in many respects, not only in terms of the total subjugation of the human rights, but also in terms of food, famine, and all the disasters which such situations bring in their way. So, in a nutshell, if the Americans are going to take action against Pakistan, it is high time that they did so.
So what are the options then before the United States? Will it go beyond tongue lashing? Because there are growing voices in the United States calling for sanctions against Pakistan. There is also a lot of US lawmakers on both sides of the political divide there in the United States that are calling for taking away the status of NMMA, which is major NATO ally status, yes, that the United States has given to Pakistan, because $23 billion in aid, security assistance particularly, has been given by the United States to Pakistan since 9/11, and all of that is taxpayers' money.
Well, I agree. This major non-NATO ally status, MNA, which had been conferred on Pakistan, has been misused in a variety of ways. In particular, to secure American assistance by Pakistan while doing the utmost it could to foster evil in Afghanistan. Now, if voices of reason are calling for action against Pakistan, then let me remind you that they have been calling for such action for quite some time. But tragically, the United States felt that it needed Pakistan's support in regard to the situation in Afghanistan. Now the US forces are out of Afghanistan for all practical purposes. I hear that there are still some Americans who are stranded in Afghanistan, some US nationals. I'm sure that the United States is trying to bring them out, but there should be no compulsion whatsoever when it comes now to taking action against the ISI and in a larger sense against the government of Pakistan. There are many ways that this can be done. You know, Pakistan has used the leverage it has with the United States to get funding not only from the United States but also from international agencies. And the US has sufficient control over these agencies to be able to close the tap. Pakistan, as it is, faces a lot of economic difficulties. China has helped it, but it can't help it ad infinitum, ad nauseum. So there are economic means which can be used to tighten controls over Pakistan, because unless this is done, the mischief potential of the Pakistani establishment cannot be reduced.
You know, there is also, Ambassador Dayal, the counter argument that is given that if sanctions are imposed on Afghanistan, it will further push a lot of Afghans towards poverty. There will be further economic crisis in Afghanistan. More youth will be driven to extremism. How would you respond to that?
Well, let me clarify that I was talking about this Pakistan factor, and the talk is about putting sanctions against Pakistan. It is difficult. Now, as regards Afghanistan, I don't think there is any sort of move to place serious sanctions against Afghanistan, because as you said, the people there are facing a lot of difficulty, and these difficulties would be compounded. But there are other means, for instance, holding back recognition and taking up the matter through the United Nations. The United Nations wants to give economic assistance to Afghanistan because of the dire situation prevailing in that country. But there can be some quid pro quo that can be extracted from the Afghanistan government, particularly in terms of its respect for human rights. So, in other words, the situation has to be seen in totality. Afghanistan cannot be viewed in isolation because the Pakistan factor is predominant in regard to the situation in that country.
So for a long-lasting solution of the Afghanistan problem, is it important to tackle Pakistan first? And the international community, including the United States, seem to have put the cart before the horse all this while.
I agree with you. Everyone seems to be keen to find a solution to the Afghanistan situation, and President Trump made a cardinal error when he signed the withdrawal, fixed a deadline for the withdrawal of US troops without putting in place an agreement between the government in Kabul and the Taliban. That was a clear case of putting the cart before the horse, because first there should have been an agreement between the Kabul government and the Taliban, and then the US forces should have been withdrawn, but he was in a hurry to withdraw his forces, and he put in place a semblance of an arrangement, of an agreement, and got his, voter base to applaud him. But the fact is, that there has to be a very realistic assessment of the ongoing situation in Afghanistan, that while the needs which are humanitarian in nature of the Afghanistan people have to be respected and they have to be attended to, but at the same time, due notice has to be taken of the ground situation in that country, and due pressure must be applied in any means that is possible on not just the authorities in Kabul but also on the Pakistan government.
Do you think that the upcoming summits like the SCO summit, the Quad summit and even the UNGA offer an opportunity to evolve a global consensus on holding Pakistan to account and holding Taliban to its promises, because it's haven't been keeping its promises? There's simply no women in the new Taliban dispensation in Afghanistan. Besides that, there is only very, very symbolic or hardly anything in terms of minority representation in the government. Their attitude towards women is also very questionable. Besides that, there are reports of summary executions of former Afghan government security forces and loyalists of the ex-government.
Well, everything that the Afghan government, the new government installed recently, the Taliban government, has been doing runs contrary to what it had been promising. Its promises have all amounted to nothing. And its biggest backers, who are the authorities in Islamabad, had been vouching on behalf of the Taliban, and they too have been proved as total liars. The fact of the matter is that there is scant respect for human rights within Afghanistan, according to the reports which one is receiving from that country. So, as regards the international role, certainly pressure can be brought to bear through the United Nations. Pakistan can be embarrassed. Pakistan should be called out, because unless it realizes that the international authorities and the world at large are aware of its duplicitous role, it will continue on its way. Pakistan should be named and shaped.
While on the one hand, there is a view that this is perhaps the best opportunity for the United States to hold Pakistan to account after the withdrawal of the US forces from Afghanistan, there is also the counter view that the US has been treading with Pakistan since the 1950s. So why would it change course now? Maybe it would still be dependent on Pakistan for intelligence cooperation or for basing some of its drones there to target any terror sanctuaries around.
Well, Munmun, there are no permanent friends, there are no permanent enemies. It is true that Pakistan has enjoyed a very close relationship with the United States from the beginning of its existence. It was a member of CENTO because it was perceived as being against the Soviets. At the same time, when Ziaul Haq was in power, then the Americans helped him along because they saw in him a front-line ally, because they needed Pakistan's support in their efforts to remove the Soviets from Afghanistan. So Pakistan profited from out of all that. Later on, I think there was a slight change, but not for long, because once again, the Americans needed Pakistan's support for sorting out the situation in Afghanistan. And Pakistan has used all this to its full advantage. It is considered to be a strategically located country. Strategically located because it borders Afghanistan and it is able to send across weapons and its own forces. You know, there are well reported instances of Pakistani forces having fought alongside the Taliban. So Pakistan has been able to play a direct role in Afghanistan because of its borders and what is then clearly its strategic location. And the Americans have been cognizant of that. But now I think the Americans do not need Pakistan in the same way as they did earlier, and they can really come down in a big way on the government in Islamabad.
Right. What, according to you, is the shelf life, if I may ask, of the new Taliban dispensation in Afghanistan. In this dispensation, there are 4 out of 33 cabinet ministers who've been to the Guantanamo Bay as detainees. One of them has a reward of $10 million on his head. 4 of them are on the UN sanctions list. There were already reports of gunfiring from the presidential palace in which reportedly Mullah Baradar was injured.
As regards your question about the shelf life of the new government in Kabul, but I hope it is not even a day, because it is a government which tramples on human rights. But the reality is that there are forces which are intent on propping it up. China, for one, stands alongside Pakistan, and the Russians also have been taking a position which is definitely sympathetic towards the new government in Kabul. So it might not be so easy to wish away the new government in Kabul. I think the Taliban authorities may stick around for some time. I don't think they are going away anytime very soon. So it's a reality with which we have to contend, but at the same time, the world has to shape its policies in regard to Afghanistan and in regard to Pakistan accordingly.
Right, Ambassador Dayal, we've seen that powers like China and even Russia have exulted in a sense over US withdrawal from this region, but they're also worried about the security implications that the withdrawal of US and NATO forces from the region can have on them. Do you think that they would be willing to be a part of a global consensus going forward? An SCO summit is coming up just this week. Quad summit coming up next. The UNGA is also to hold its session, because we've seen both China and Russia speaking in different voices as far as the August 30 UNGA resolution is concerned. We haven't seen that kind of consensus approach so far.
You know, there is every likelihood that certainly the Chinese and the Russians will not see eye to eye in all respects. But at the same time, there are some broad issues on which their interests do coincide, and they speak with the same voice. And certainly, the idea of keeping the Americans out of the region is certainly one of these issues on which they are in agreement. So, in other words, while we may not witness the Russians and the Chinese totally viewing matters in exactly the same manner, but at the same time, on many issues relating to Afghanistan, they will speak with the same voice. They will have the same interests, and certainly keeping America out is one of those.
Right, Ambassador Prabhu Dayal, thank you so much for having joined us with your views. Prime Minister Narendra Modi in a tweet has said that he was happy to speak to Australian Prime Minister Scott Morrison. Both the leaders reviewed the rapid progress in the India-Australia Comprehensive Strategic Partnership, including the recent 2+2 dialogue. They also exchanged perspectives on regional developments and the forthcoming Quad meeting. The 76th session of the United Nations General Assembly opened at the UN headquarters in New York on Tuesday. Maldivian diplomat Abdullah Shahid, who was elected as the president of the 76th UNGA in June, took oath of office during the ceremony and received the gavel from Volkan Bozkır, president of the 75th UNGA. In his speech, Shahid said his presidency will highlight hope in recovering from COVID-19, rebuilding sustainably, responding to the needs of the planet, respecting the rights of all people, and revitalizing the United Nations. UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres warmly congratulated Shahid of the Maldives on his election. The UN chief called for the end of war against each other, stressing the urgency to fight against humanity's common enemy, COVID-19 pandemic. From 21st September, over 80 heads of states and senior officials are expected to attend a high-level general debate of the UNGA. The top US general secretly called his Chinese counterpart twice over concerns that the then President Donald Trump could spark a war with China as his potential election loss loomed, and in its aftermath, that's what a leading U.S. daily has reported. U.S. General Mark Milley, chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, called General Li Zuangqing of the People's Liberation Army on 30th October 2020, 4 days before the election, and again on the 8th of January, 2 days after Donald Trump supporters led a deadly riot at the U.S. Capitol, the newspaper reported. In the calls, Milley sought to assure Lee that the United States was stable and not going to attack, and if there were to be an attack, he would alert his counterpart ahead of time, as per the report. The report was based on Peril, which is a new book by journalists Bob Woodward and Robert Costa, which they said relied on interviews with 200 sources and is due to be released next week. Trump in a statement cast doubts on the story, calling it fabricated. He said if the story was true, then Milley should be tried for treason. For the record, I never even thought of attacking China. That's what Trump said. Milley's office declined to comment. Republican Senator Marco Rubio called on President Joe Biden, a Democrat, to immediately fire Milley. Asked about the report, the White House spokesperson Karine Jean-Pierre declined to comment and referred questions to the Joint Chiefs of Staff and the Defense Department. Trump, a Republican, named Milley to the top military post in 2018, but began criticizing him as well as other appointees and former staffers after losing the presidential election to Biden in November 2020. The newspaper also reported that Milley was motivated to contact Beijing the second time, in part due to an 8th January call with the U.S. House of Representatives Speaker Nancy Pelosi, who had asked the general what safeguards were in place to prevent an unstable president from launching a nuclear strike. Extreme weather events will cost the United States well over $100 billion this year, topping last year's cost of $99 billion. Speaking in Colorado, U.S. President Joe Biden said that nearly 1 in 3 American communities had been struck in the past few months by weather disasters exacerbated by climate change. President Joe Biden on Tuesday made Colorado the latest backdrop, featuring nagging drought conditions and raging wildfires in the U.S. West, to build support for infrastructure spending plans aimed at fighting the growing threat of climate change. Biden visited Idaho, where how global warming has squashed the region's landscape, after he visited California and Colorado.
Nearly 1 in 3 Americans call home have been struck by weather disasters in just the past few months. In addition to the lost lives shattered, extreme weather cost America last year $99 billion. $99 billion extreme weather cost last year. And it's going to break the record this year. It's going to be well over $100 billion. We know what the driver is: climate change. We know what's causing climate change: human activity. This is no longer subject to debate. The only debate is around what we do to confront this crisis. And that shouldn't be a debate.
Every year, September 15th is celebrated as International Day of Democracy to encourage governments around the world to strengthen and consolidate democracy. The day was observed for the first time in 2008. This day, celebrated by the UN, marks an opportunity to review the state of democracy around the world. Each year highlights a specific theme. Past themes have included stronger democracies, strengthening the voices of citizens, accountability and political tolerance. In 2020, the theme was COVID-19, a spotlight on democracy. In 2021, the United Nations has called for strengthening democratic resilience in the face of future crises. The International Day of Democracy is also an opportunity to raise awareness and educate the public about the democratic rights, to highlight the important role of parliaments, their capacity and mandate to deliver justice, peace, development and human rights. UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres took to Twitter on International Day of Democracy. In a tweet, he said, and I quote, "Every crisis, whether public health, environmental or financial, poses a threat to democracy because the rights of the most vulnerable can quickly be ignored. As we mark Democracy Day, let us commit to recognizing human rights and the rule of law as fundamental to democracy." Let's now take a look at updates on COVID-19 from around the world. As of now, over 22.66 crore people have contracted the COVID-19 virus, while over 20 crore 33 lakh people have recovered worldwide. More than 46 lakh 62,000 people have lost their lives to the coronavirus globally. The United States have been the worst affected since the start of the pandemic and remains so as the Delta variant has accelerated the case tally. The US has more than 4 crore 20 lakh cases reported of COVID-19 and over 6 lakh 79,000 deaths have been reported in the country so far. The Dutch government on Tuesday announced it was easing COVID-19 restrictions and will introduce a corona pass showing proof of vaccination to go to bars, restaurants, clubs or cultural events. Prime Minister Mark Rutte said most social distancing requirements will be dropped from the 25th of September. The move mirrors announcements in other European countries. Rutte told a news conference he understood the emotional toll social distancing had taken on most people, added that it remains prudent for people to keep their distance. The measures that remain will be a mask requirement for public transportation and schools and the recommendation that people work from home when possible. The corona pass will be required for people aged 13 and up to enter venues such as restaurants, bars, cinemas, museums, concerts and festivals, both indoors and outdoors. More than 70% of the Dutch population have received at least one COVID-19 vaccine. Also, while 65% are fully vaccinated. The government's health advisory board on Tuesday said there was no need for a third shot known as a booster. Businesses at Malaysia's prime holiday destination are gearing up to welcome the return of tourists this week as the country takes an early step towards recovery from a devastating coronavirus crisis. Langkawi, a cluster of 99 islands in the Straits of Malacca, will reopen from 16 September to fully vaccinated travelers as part of a domestic tourism bubble, with strict protocols in place to thwart the spread of the coronavirus. The plan is similar to that introduced in Thailand, which started with the July reopening of Phuket to vaccinated foreign tourists. Malaysia has yet to invite foreign tourists to return. Malaysia has recorded 2 million coronavirus cases overall, one of Asia's highest per capita infection rates, and more than 20,000 deaths. African Union's Special Envoy Strive Masiyiwa called on the IMF and the World Bank to put a mechanism in place allowing poor countries to access vaccines. Director of Africa's Centers for Disease Control, John Kengasong, said on Tuesday that less than 3.5% of Africans are vaccinated against COVID-19, far short of its official target of 60%. African Union Special Envoy Strive Masiyiwa called on the IMF and the World Bank to put a mechanism in place allowing poor countries to access vaccines.
The world needs to understand, we always knew that a crisis like this could emerge. So we really urge those institutions such as the IMF and the World Bank to pick up the leadership on this issue and put in place a standby capacity, particularly for poor nations, to have access to vaccines.
World Health Organization Chief Tedros Ghebreyesus, speaking at the same briefing, said that the continent was being left behind by the rest of the world and that this would allow the coronavirus to keep circulating. The WHO has called on countries and manufacturers to share information on vaccines deliveries.
So far, just 2 countries in Africa have reached the 40% target, the lowest of any region. And I said last week, that's not because African countries don't have the capacity or experience to roll out vaccines. It's because they have been left behind by the rest of the world. More than 5.7 billion doses have been administered globally, but only 2% of those have been administered in Africa. This leaves people at high risk of disease and death, exposed to a deadly virus against which many other people around the world enjoy protection.
Let's now take a look at news from across the world.
Heavy rainfall in France has led to floods. Local authorities have reported 2 people missing. Weather Service Meteo France had placed the Guard department in red alert over risks of flooding and storms earlier, which has now been lowered 2 levels to a yellow alert. Around 800 rescuers remain mobilized to secure flooded areas in the department. Japanese Prime Minister Yoshihide Suga called North Korea's ballistic missile launch outrageous and strongly condemned the action as a threat to peace and security of the region. His remarks came after the South Korean military said that North Korea fired a pair of ballistic missiles off its east coast. Japan's Coast Guard also reported an object that could be a ballistic missile that was fired from North Korea and landed outside its exclusive economic zone. Suga said he would hold an emergency National Security Committee meeting to discuss the launches. China's State Councillor and Foreign Minister Wang Yi met South Korean President Moon Jae-in and Foreign Minister Chung Wi-yong in Seoul on Wednesday as North Korea fired a pair of ballistic missiles off its east coast. As Germany's long-standing Chancellor Angela Merkel is going to step down following federal elections, she expressed confidence of great continuity from her successor regarding interest in the region. Speaking during the head of government's meeting in Tirana, Chancellor Merkel said, "Heart will keep beating for the Western Balkans even after she leaves office." In the US, Californians cast their vote in a special recall election held on Tuesday to decide whether to recall Governor Gavin Newsom. Newsom is fighting for his political future in only the second gubernatorial recall election in state history in 55 attempts. The campaign to oust the Democratic governor began with a conservative Republican group and gained steam during the pandemic. In the Brazilian town of Piracicaba, at least 7 people killed after a light aircraft crashed 15 seconds after takeoff. According to the local authorities, the victims included the business tycoon Celso Silveira Melo Filho, his wife Maria Luzia Menehel, his 3 children, the pilot Celso Carloni, co-pilot Giovanni Gullo. The aircraft crashed into a forest area near the Technology College of Sao Paulo, setting off an explosion and fire. The cause of the accident is being probed by the authorities. The Venezuelan government wants a top envoy, Alex Saab, who has been charged with money laundering and is close to President Nicolas Maduro, to take part in its political dialogue with the opposition, a move that threatens to stir tensions. Venezuela National Assembly President Jorge Rodriguez said that the government would incorporate Alex Saab, who was jailed in Cabo Verde, as a member of its delegation at the dialogue process taking place in Mexico. Rodriguez is the lead delegate for Maduro's socialist government to the Norway-mediated talks with representatives of opposition leader João Guaidó, aimed at resolving the South American country's long-standing political crisis. World Today Desk, DD India.
Yet another billionaire entrepreneur is set to ride into space as Inspiration 4 mission is all set to blast off from the Kennedy Space Center at Cape Canaveral, Florida on Thursday morning IST. SpaceX rocket ship is set to make history as the first all-civilian crew will launch into Earth orbit.
The crew of a SpaceX rocket ship, who hope to be the first civilians to attempt Earth orbit, said on Tuesday that they feel grateful to be a part of the historic mission a day ahead of their prospective launch. The so-called Inspiration 4 mission will blast off from the Kennedy Space Center at Cape Canaveral, Florida. Once in Earth orbit, the vehicle will circle the globe once every 90 minutes at more than 27,360 kilometers per hour, or roughly 22 times the speed of sound. The target altitude is 575 kilometers beyond the orbits of the International Space Station or even the Hubble Space Telescope. Billionaire entrepreneur Jared Isaacman will lead the other 3 fellow spaceflight novices on a 3-day trip from Cape Canaveral to splashdown in the Atlantic. The crew vehicle, dubbed Resilience, was set for liftoff with a 5-hour targeted launch window that opens 8 p.m. EDT on Wednesday, which translates to 5:30 a.m. Indian Standard Time on Thursday.
Some great contributions that are coming out of that, but if we're going to go to the moon again, and we're going to go to Mars and beyond, and we got to get a little outside of our comfort zone and take that, next step in that direction. So that was really the rationale.
The Inspiration 4 crew will have no part to play in operating their spacecraft. Isaac Mann, who is rated to fly commercial and military jets, has assumed the role of mission commander, while Proctor, 51, once a NASA astronaut candidate herself, has been designated as the mission pilot. She was selected to join the team through an online contest.
There have been 3 black female astronauts that have made it to space, and knowing that I'm going to be the 4th means that I have this opportunity to not only accomplish my dream, but also inspire the next generation of women of color and girls of color, and really get them to think about reaching for the stars and what that means.
Rounding out the crew are Chief Medical Officer Haley Akrinox, 29, a bone cancer survivor, and Mission Specialist Chris Sembrowski, 42, a U.S. Air Force veteran and aerospace data engineer. 4 crewmates have spent 5 months making rigorous preparations, including altitude fitness, centrifuge, microgravity and simulator training, emergency drills, classroom work and medical exams. SpaceX is easily the most well-established player in the burgeoning constellation of commercial rocket ventures. Rival companies Virgin Galactic and Blue Origin both recently celebrated their debut astro-tourism missions with their respective founding executives, billionaires Richard Branson and Jeff Bezos, each going along for the ride. Bureau Report, DD India.
And with that, we come to the close of this edition of World Today. Thanks for watching.